tectonics. So I heard Pangea mentioned. 250 million years ago, all of the land masses that we recognize now were all together as a single land mass called Pangea, right? And that becomes important for the distribution of a lot of higher taxonomic, not just the fishes, but a lot of groups of organisms. But today it's all about fish, right? So there's certain patterns, and we'll see some of that. So we've got those geological events that could separate land masses, for example, can raise up mountains that separate watersheds. So you go along the Rocky Mountains, you have the continental divide. So you have rivers that flow towards the Gulf of Mexico and Atlantic, or that flow over into the Pacific Ocean, right? So you've got those types of processes. That also starts to fall under biogeographic barriers, right? So species that are on the Atlantic slope, right, that you're in rivers that are going towards the Atlantic Ocean, they're not going over into the Pacific side, right? With exceptions to that, and not counting humans moving them around, right? I heard somebody talking about, well, if they're in this river, they can't necessarily get over to the next river, right? So land in between rivers can be a huge barrier. Now there are some cases, because all rivers flow to the coast, right? There are some species that can live in and tolerate salt water for a little bit and can move among rivers, right? But you have others that are up in the headwaters, and there's no way they're getting from one river to the next river basin and so on, right? Then there's our environmental factors. That's our broader type of processes. Again, that can be, are they in lakes? Are they in rivers? What is the average temperature? That could be air temperature, water temperature. What is the average amount of sunshine that is hitting the river? Is the river deeper? Is the river shallower? And so on. And then finally, this is where we get into our species interactions and so on, okay? So what we're going to do is to go through and sort of explore each of these in a little bit more detail, just as a few examples, right? We're not going to go through every single fish group or anything, unless you want to. All right, so plate tectonics and geographic barriers is going to start to influence the assemblage. So the color code, you don't have to know all the different regions, but these are the major global biogeographic regions around here. So we're over here in the Nearctic, there's Neotropics and so on. But if you look at the family Cyprinidae, which is the largest freshwater fish family in the world, right, from the exam, they are found all over Asia. They also get down into the Indo-Malaysian Peninsula, and then they're over here in North America. Look where they're not. They're not in South America. They're not in Africa, right? So the largest fish family in the world, and they're not present down here in Australia either, right? These are good, solid freshwater fishes. So, did they cross the ocean? No, right? They have this distribution because the ancestors of the cyprinids evolved when this was all together as a single landmass, right? And so now, when you have the breakup of the landmass through plate tectonics, you get continued evolution of that group. But their common ancestor was present when this was together as a single landmass. All right, questions? Another example, the family Percidae. So again, present over here in Europe and Asia, over here in North America, not present anywhere down here in the southern hemisphere, or in the southern hemisphere regions, okay? Family Centrarchidae, only here in North America. So they evolved after the land masses were separated, but again, Percidae is present up here because their common ancestor was present while these land masses were still together, okay? So we've got that type of process that is influencing the distribution. Where were their earliest ancestors evolved relative to the state of the different land masses? Once they separate, these primary freshwater fishes cannot make it across the ocean. All right, questions? All right, so let's get to North America now. So you look at particular groups of particularly closely related species. So we've got different regions. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, remember where 6 is, but there's 7 right there, okay? So I'm just to help you orient, there you are right here at Cape Girardeau. So essentially this is the Ozark Plateau. Euxonum, actually, that's the other one, is down here on the Ouachita Plateau in the Ouachita Mountains. Then you've got sort of the western central highlands of Tennessee, then also going all up in the Appalachian Plateau for these other species, okay? How would you explain this particular pattern? Any ideas? Notice that none of this particular group, so all these are very closely related species of darters, good freshwater stream fishes. They're absent all up here. What happened up here?
Glaciation.
Glaciation, right? So this was all basically during the last ice age, the ice sheets, the major glaciers, advanced as far south essentially as the modern day Mississippi River and the modern day Ohio River. So all of this was under glaciers at some point in the past, right? So this area is all relatively flat, but then you get the more mountainous areas of the Ozarks, of the Appalachians, right? So you have places where the fishes could continue to survive, while the other places were under huge sheets of ice, okay? What about down here? You can't really see it, but essentially down here, Mississippi, Alabama, and so on, these species aren't present. It is also very flat down there. What happened down here? Any ideas?
Didn't the oceans take seafood or was it sea?
So a lot of times when the ice melts, when those ice sheets melt, right, and various other processes that happen, the ocean, the sea levels rise, okay? This area was all underwater at one point in time. So what you have is essentially refugia. Refugium is singular, refugia is plural. What you have are uplifted mountainous areas that were not under ice sheets, nor were they under the ocean, right? So these are places, refuges, where these species were able to survive over a longer period of time and continue to evolve.
What did you say it was? Sorry.
You do what, where?
The refugee?
Refugia are places where the species or their ancestors could survive, right? When other areas were not survivable because of environmental conditions. And in this case, being under an ice sheet, you're not going to survive as a fish. Being under seawater, you're not going to survive as a freshwater fish.
Is that where the term refuge comes from?
Or refugia is basically using refuge. They're the same words, yeah. That's exactly what it is. It is a refuge. And we could say that, but as scientists. All right? So let's put this together. So this is what's known as a spaghetti net. Because it looks like you cooked some spaghetti and flung it against the wall. But, so the orange line right here, that's the glacial maximum. So during the Pleistocene, right, so from about 2.5 million years ago to about 12,000 years ago, you had 5 major glacial advances, and you don't have to know that. But what I want you to understand is the maximum area that was covered was from here down to approximately this orange line. Okay? So this area was all under ice sheets at some point in time. This green line right here, this is known as the coastal plain. Okay? So this is all relatively flat. And so when sea levels have been higher in the past, as much as about 150 meters higher, this was all underwater at some point in time. So again, under ocean water. Field trip, get on I-55, drive south, right? A little before you get to exit 80 at Benton, right? You're gonna be up on a ridge, and the slope's gonna go down, road's gonna go down, and then it is flat all the way to the ocean. That's the edge of that's where the coastal plain starts, right? So we are right here at the edge of the Ozark Plateau. So essentially, we're basically just trying to get Missouri on here, but I can't, there's too much spaghetti. So, but basically you're driving right down in here and you're going down onto that coastal plain, right? You can do the same thing if you're on Highway N. If you're going to Miller Reserve, you're on Highway N, driving south of Scott City, and suddenly you come down and you hit Highway E and everything is flat because you're suddenly on the coastal plain, right? So this is an area that is entirely underwater. So what you have is these pinched off areas, because these are your interior highlands over here, the Ozarks and Ouachitas. Here's the Appalachian Plateau over here, right? So this is all elevated. It's never underwater, and it was never under ice sheets. So you had refugia. You had places where species could continue to survive, okay? So now, the spaghetti. Each individual circle, right? Each individual circle is the boundary for the range of one single species. Okay? So some species clearly have moved farther north after the retreat of the ice sheets and so on. But notice where you've got this, right? There's a whole bunch of species that basically share that common distribution. Same thing over here in the central highlands and then over here in the eastern highlands. Okay? So that process, that refugia, was important for a lot of species, because you had continued evolution, right? So you have your highest diversity in North America, right? Cyprinids, percids, darters, right? So minnows and shiners, darters, many of your invertebrates and so on, all have their highest diversity right here. Mollusks, freshwater bivalves, highest diversity over in here, right? Because they were all protected. They weren't, because they were in this elevated area. But the other thing to recognize, the mountains as we see them now, were not always in that configuration. They have moved around, which has caused the streams to move around. So you can have a stream that was like connected, right? And now you have some geological changes that separate them into separate streams. So you could have a single population, they become separate streams, they're now two separate populations, they can evolve into different species. That's almost certainly what has happened for all the minnows and shiners in this area, all the darters in this area, and so on. Okay? We good? All right. So let's start to focus in a little more detail on the environmental factors. So I'll give you a couple moments, although we've already talked about several of them. Actually, I guess since we have, let's just move along. Okay? So, first we'll do environmental factors, then we'll do species interactions. That one we haven't talked too much, so let's just sort of brainstorm right now. What kind of species interactions might determine who's present? Predation, right? Predator-prey interactions. Competition will be a big one, right? Remember competitive exclusion principle. Two species, similar niches, only one can be there.
Herbivory.
Or herbivory, right? Which is a different type of, it's similar to predation, but it's not exactly the same thing, right? But it is that basically where you have one organism consuming another organism, okay? What else we got? Anything else? I've got one listed, but I cannot really clearly think of examples because I don't know that they exist.
Obligatory symbiotic relationships.
Symbiosis, right? So there's a lot of symbioses that occur in the marine environment, right? But I just cannot think of any. And if you know of something.
What about how certain species of clam, their Glauconium they're kind of targeted towards certain species of fish?
Okay, I was thinking about symbiosis among fishes.
Oh, okay.
So, but that does definitely qualify, right? That definitely does qualify, and that's a really good example. I'll try to remember to talk about that in a bit.
Would the, I guess, mussels don't count as fish, right?
Mussels don't count as
Okay,
fish,
yeah.
but that ties directly
Yeah.
to Teresa's thing. So I'll go ahead and talk about it.
Yeah.
So I was looking for a clamshell, there's probably some over there.
Yeah.
So if you guys are familiar with mussels, some of the freshwater species things, they are, What they do is for them to reproduce, they produce what are called glaucidia. And the glaucidia, in a way, look sort of like clams, but they don't. They're really different, okay? They look like little Pac-Man is really what they look like. And so what happens is that in some cases, the mussels just release the glaucidia into the water. But in other cases, they are specialized for particular host fish. Right? So what will happen is that the mussels actually have like modifications of the mantles, and it'll look like a prey item that a fish will eat. And they'll actually flick it and move it, and it looks really like the prey item, right? So a darter, for example, might eat a chironomid worm, and then the mussel has this mantle modification that looks like that. So what happens then is when the fish comes over and tries to bite it, then the mussel releases the glaucidia, right? And the glaucidia just sit here like this. But when they get close to the gills, then they're basically salts that are released by the gills. Remember we talked about osmoregulation, right? So salts come out, and that triggers the glaucidia to start actually doing that. You can actually, if you got them in the thing, they'll just sit there, pour a little water into the bowl, and suddenly they start going like this. And so what happens is they clamp onto the gills. And so they become parasites, right? So they're sitting there on the gills for a while, and they will be there for a couple of weeks or so. And then they eventually will transform into very small mussels, and they will drop off and then grow into adult mussels if all goes well, right? But you do have mussels will target particular host species. And so again, the mantles are modified to look like the prey. They've evolved to look like the prey of their host fishes for that. Some are general, some are more specialized. That's a really good example.
Would lamprey technically be considered part of symbiosis since it's a form of parasitism?
That would be, yep. Yeah, so the microparasites for those that show that, yeah. Good. Anything else? I'm happy with those. All right, so here's what I have for it, question mark, and I said I wasn't thinking of examples, but I completely forgot. Obviously, I'm familiar with glaucidia, but that's something I didn't think about, and we just talked about micropredation and so on. So, environment, temperature, water flow, again, that's something we're going to talk about. Water acidity, right? Calcium content in the water, conductivity gets into solids in the water. Is the water turbid? Right? Is there a lot of sediments in it? Is the water clear? Right? So there's a lot of different environmental factors that are going to come into play, and then certainly predator-prey interactions, competition, and for at least some groups, definitely some forms of symbiosis. Anyone got any whiteout? I'll just put them right here and knock out the question one. Or maybe I got to do it on a computer screen. It'll show up over there. All right? Any questions on that? All right, so to this point, remember what we were talking about was the potential assemblage. But now we got to think about this in a little bit more depth, because there's the natural assemblage and then there's the observed assemblage. Okay? Because there are still factors that are going to come into play in what could be present. So again, rather than groups on this, we'll just continue to move along. So one of the things that happens is that streams do become naturally modified over time, right? So there are natural disturbances. So you have streams that will move along, right? And eventually they might cut the bank. So you have, if you've been around any stream around here, you'll see where you'll have the roots hanging out on one side and so on. And eventually some of that bank is going to fall into the river, and that's going to affect the way things are going. There is, I put myself on the spot, Old Plantation Access. It's a conservation area that's up in northwest Cape Girardeau County. It's on the Whitewater River. And it used to be a really nice place, a nice, beautiful, shallow riffle. It was good for fishing, it was good for seining fish and so on. And then you had some changes, more or less natural changes to the river, and it became much wider and deeper. And so what was this really nice riffle area is suddenly deeper, and that changed the types of species that are present and so on, right? But that's a natural process. Streams and rivers move around over time, right? Deeper pools can collect sediments, and so they can become shallower over time. right? So the idea here is simply that lakes, rivers, it doesn't matter, they change through various natural types of processes, and then we come along and screw it up even more. All right, so this is Big Creek in North Carolina. This is where it had been screwed up through human disturbances, and so basically tried to reclaim it back into natural conditions, and so you get back to a more natural state. That's one of the things we'll often try to do as conservation managers, right? That's one of the jobs, if you're working with the MDC, if you're a private land manager, you're gonna work with the landowner and say, how can I go from this to this, right? And this is what you'll do, is try to work with the landowner to say, here are the things that you need to do. You want to put in riparian corridors and not have your trees harvested all the way up to the edge and those types of things. All right? All right, this one I'll leave as an exercise for you guys. So fundamental niche, realized niche, and guild. Fundamental niche, realized niche. If you prefer, fundamental niche.
You're fundamental.
I'm a niche person, but you might be a niche person. That's fine.
Okay, Patrick. What's a
Niche.
fundamental?
I learned it's niche, but I hear a lot of people say
Why do
niche.
you keep picking on me
You say
today?
what?
I say niche.
Yep, and there's nothing wrong with that.
I thought you were gonna say there's a lot wrong with that.
No,
Okay, Patrick.
there's a whole lot. of
Again,
people
why do
that
you
say-
keep picking on me today?
Okay, Zoe. What do you think a fundamental niche is? That theoretically, it would be, it has this role in the ecosystem.
Fundamental is like what they realize is what they do.
Oh gosh.
Versus realized, like, it does have this niche in the ecosystem. So like if something were to get rid of micropredators, for example, fundamentally it could, but realized is if it actually can.
I'm saying no.
I know, I just saw the look of judgment.
I was trying to be blank.
No, you weren't. I saw
Well, I was trying. I didn't say I was succeeding.
that.
That is my blank look. That's my bacon. Nobody's home up here.
Oh, Pat. Buddy, how many coffees did you have this morning?
That's only my second one.
I think you need 2 more.
I think I do too.
All right, we got it all figured out?
Look like what time did you go to bed?
I couldn't fall asleep till well after 1.
What time did you get
All right.
4:30.
Fundamental niche versus realized niche. What's the difference?
Fundamental is what environmental resources they could use, realizes what environmental resources they do use.
Right. So the niche is basically the fundamental niche and the ecological niche have the same definition. And essentially all of the resources that are needed by an organism to survive. Right? And so there we think about resources broadly. That's everything from pH of the water, water temperature, water flow, water depth, substrate, the food types, and so on, right? If they need vegetation because they're ambush predators, that's part of their resources, okay? So fundamental niche is the same definition as ecological niche. All of the resources needed by an organism to survive. But because organisms exist in a community, there are some other species that also use some of those resources, at least in part. So sometimes they will use a narrower set of the resources. And so what they actually use is the realized niche. So fundamental is what can they potentially use, realized niche is what do they actually use, okay? And guild.
Oh, I forgot.
It's the species use the same resource in the same way.
Yeah, right? So basically when we talk about assemblage, we can say like we have an assemblage of fishes, right? When we start talking about darters and the specific resources, like they're using a ripple, or if they're eating the invertebrates, Now we're talking about a group of organisms that are using the same resource in a very similar way, and that's our guild, right? So again, guild gets to be a sort of a more focused part of thinking about an assemblage. Right, so there we go. Fundamental niche, potentially used, realized niche is what they actually use, and then in the guild is the different species in an assemblage that use similar resources in a similar way, and thus high potential for competition. So again, back in the day, back in the 80s and so on, that was a whole lot of research being done on like darters and freshwater streams and minnows and so on, is microhabitat partitioning. How would that guild divide up their resources? Because in some cases, remember we just showed the spaghetti map. We said over there in Tennessee and over in the Ozarks, where you have really high diversity. You can go over to Duck Creek in Tennessee. It's part of the Tennessee River system. You can get on certain riffles and you're going to get easily 40 species of fishes, and you might get 15 to 20 species of darters. Really beautiful area, really high diversity. How do you get so many species together coexisting? And that's because they're partitioning up their resources, which is what we're going to talk about. Okay, we good? All right, so resource partitioning can reduce competition when resources are limited, right? So remember, competition occurs when one or more resources are limiting, right? In most cases, water is not a limiting resource, right? There are places where it can dry up, but for the most part, you got permanent streams. Water is not a limiting resource, so they're not competing for that. But food often will be a limiting resource. So competition by definition is for one or more limited resources, okay? So in this particular example, what we've got is sort of a double axis. So you've got resource, and so in this case it's prey size. So smaller prey to larger prey. And in this particular example, that's tied specifically to gill raker length and size, right? Because for filter feeders, the gill rakers can filter out food, right? So if you've got smaller prey size, then you're going to have finer rakers, right? Because big coarse rakers with a lot of space isn't going to filter out fine food. But then when you have larger food items, then you can get away with having larger rakers, okay? So in this particular example, under species A, you got sort of an average prey size and an average number of gill rakers, okay? As prey size gets smaller, you get fewer rakers or more fine rakers. Larger prey, more coarse rakers, right? But you got a range of variation. Anything outside of that, the species doesn't survive, okay? But that's if you have just one species, you can use a fairly broad range of resources. But for multiple species to coexist, they partition up or divide up the resource. So in this example, now we have two species, A and B. So species A is sort of specialized for slightly smaller prey items. Species B specialized for slightly larger prey items, which is reflected in the differences in the sizes of their gill rakers. Okay? So that's what resource partitioning is dividing up the resources. So species become more specialized and good at getting a particular resource, but it's a narrower range of that particular resource. Right, so again, this is the same example expanded out to now include 4 different species. But sometimes what can happen, let's say, let me back up, I'm going to be hypothetical here. But let's say, for example, we've got species A and B, right? So here's the range of their raker size, right? Which is related again to the range of the prey size. But what can happen is you can end up more finely dividing this, where actually individuals of the same species can shift, right? So they can even go towards more specialized towards the finer end of the spectrum or the larger end of the spectrum. And it's called character displacement. And that occurs when you have two species that co-occur. So one species by itself might have that full range of breaker size. Bring in a second species, one species shifts down to, like, say, the more fine rakers, the other species has the coarser rakers, and that process can continue, okay? And that's what character displacement is. When you have two or more species that co-occur, you'll have a character that will shift away from each other, become more different, and that reduces competition and allows them to coexist, okay? But that shift occurs only when they're present with another species. So if it's not present, then they might have a broader range of that particular character. But when competitors are present, they shift or displace to become more different. That reduces competition. Okay? Let me give you a particular example of that. So again, two species of darters. This is the rainbow darter, Ethiostoma ceruleum up top. This is the orange-throated darter, Ethiostoma spectabile on the bottom, okay? So if you look at the local panel, and by the way, these two species are chosen for this, and you don't really pick it out here, but a lot of times when you have them in hand, unless your eye's really trained, it's hard to tell them apart. They really do look a lot alike, okay? So here's darter assemblage species number. So basically the number of different species, okay? When it is just these two species present, when you have just the rainbow darter and the orange-throated darter, their body size, so this is mean, maximum, standard length, their body size is actually pretty similar, okay? So the black squares is ceruleum, the white squares is spectabile, okay? So on average, rainbow darter's a little bit longer, but pretty much the same size, right, within the range of variations on them. But what happens when you bring in a third species of darter? These two actually diverge apart. So the rainbow darter actually becomes a little bit larger on average, spectabile actually becomes a little smaller on average. Add in a fourth darter species, and that difference becomes even greater. That's character displacement, right? Under typical circumstances, if it's just these two, their body size is similar. But as you increase species, what you're doing is increasing competition for resources. These two are really competitively similar to each other. They have very similar ecological niches. So as the number, as species richness increases, that character, in this case, average body length, really displaces. They become much more different from each other. And so now, smaller spectabile eats smaller food items, larger rainbow darter eats larger food items, right? So you're reducing competition. Okay? Any questions on that? Another example, using darters. I actually did a fair enough amount of work on these guys in the past, so I know them fairly well. So there's a darter. So you have it's Persina nigrofasciata and Persina sciera, okay? Persina nigrofasciata is the black-banded darter. The other one's a black-sided darter, I think. Sorry, Persina sciera and nigrofasciata. That's all you need to know. They occur generally allopatrically, different geographic areas, but they overlap for part of their range. Okay? Where they are separate from each other, they basically look like this. So they're kind of brown, just sort of a drab brown. Persina is not colorful as a whole, but they have a pretty broad black stripe that runs from the back behind the operculum all the way down to the tail. Okay? Where the two co-occur, one of these, the black-banded darter, nigrofasciata, gets these extensions. So the black bar actually will get these vertical bands on it. The other one does not. Right? This is only where they co-occur. Where they co-occur, one gets these elongated vertical bands, and now the males look different. It's easier for the females to pick out the proper males. But that only happens when they're sympatric. In allopatric, they look the same. So another example of character displacement.
So if you set up a habitat and you put those two in there, and then you add the third or fourth species, is the increasing and decreasing of size to allocate for the other species to also have food, or is it to try and drive the other species?
Neither, right? So, and it doesn't matter if they can't change the size, right? It's not like, oh, there's suddenly a new species present, let me grow smaller. I can't do that, right? I can't physically reduce my size. It's just not going to happen. But the idea is that if you go across their range and sample, when you get just these two, they're similar. But as the species richness increases, then their average size changes.
Okay.
But it's not driving one out, because if these are different in size, they're not competing with each other, or competition is greatly reduced, because now the smaller species is eating smaller food items, bigger species eating bigger food items.
Okay, I didn't
Right.
know if it was to draw or to, make the other species that got added leave, or.
No, it's you got to remember that these, again, think about that filtering process. You have the species that are present in that given area. Absent any type of disturbance, that is sort of the fixed species composition for the most part. So those size differences are sort of longer term changes, but they're not permanent changes, right? So it's what we call plasticity. And so it's a character that is somewhat plastic depending on what the particular conditions. So let's say, not that we would wish this, but let's say that 2 of those species went extinct out of that particular area. So now richness is reduced, right? So it's not an overnight change, but over time you might expect the populations of both species to start to show these changes in the size difference due to changes in species richness.
Okay.
But it's not an immediate type of response.
That was one of my questions.
Okay.
It was just like how long it truthfully takes for
That I honestly have no idea, right? That you could try to do it in a lab, but I think that would be a difficult and not guaranteed kind of because you don't know how many generations it's going to take. You don't know if changes that you're seeing are actually due to laboratory conditions, not natural environment. And it's certainly not ethical to start, well, let me just add some more species and see what happens over the next 20 years, or let me just remove species from this area and see what happens for 20 years. So this is really just sort of an observational thing. Given the situation in terms of how many species are present, we see this difference. And so therefore we infer that the increased species richness is causing these 2 species to become more divergent, which reduces competition through resource partitioning, right? So this is a pattern that is consistent with that hypothesis, but we don't know for sure that that's what really the case is. And again, we can't just go in and start altering the community composition, certainly not ethically. Anything else? All right. All right, stream order. Before I talk about stream order, I'm going to give you a paper. This is the required reading. So this will be just like the previous paper on how fishes swim. This is talking about how fishes are distributed based on the size of river and that type of thing, okay? So as before, we're not going to discuss it other than sort of, we're talking generally about things now. Definitely read the paper, use the study guides, because one of the study guides does specifically ask questions related to this particular paper, so that can help you focus on the particular areas, okay? All right, so one of the things that fish people will often do, let me rephrase that. One of the things that people that study organisms that live in streams and rivers do is talk about stream order, okay? And stream order is just a nice, convenient way of talking about relative stream size, okay? So you can go from order 1 all the way up to order big, right? So Mill Creek in Pennsylvania, first order stream. So this is basically the very headwaters of the river, okay? The very headwaters, generally where you might have some intermittent flow that can actually dry out a little bit, but you also will generally start to get permanent flow, okay? At the confluence, Mississippi River, the confluence with the Ohio is stream order 11, okay? So clearly stream order refers to stream and river size, okay? Now, the way you increase size, so notice in this diagram here, we have two order 1 streams, okay? So really small, looks something like this, okay? Whenever you have two streams or two rivers, two streams of the same order that merge together, now your order size goes up by 1. So stream order 1, they come together at the confluence, that creates stream order 2. Notice down here, here's another order 1 stream that comes in, but they are two different sizes, so it is still stream order 2. So to increase size, you always have to merge two streams of the same size, right? So here we have stream order 2, stream order 2. When those two merge together, now you hit stream order 3. Bring together 2 3s, you go to 4, 2 4s, go to 5, etc., etc. Okay? So when you're talking low stream orders, it's a nice way of just saying, okay, if I say low stream orders, I'm talking about maybe order 1 or 2 or 3, something like that. Certainly those types of streams have different ecological, different environmental characteristics than if I'm talking 6, 7, 8, 9, 11, right? So certainly that looks different than that. And so certainly the fishes up here are subject to very different types of environmental conditions than fishes here, okay? So what you have now, and that's the point of this paper, is it's basically going to talk about the river continuum concept, okay? So make sure you read that, because it's not like it is this discrete change. It's not obvious that you change. The differences between order 1 and order 2 are not that dramatically different. Between order 2 and 3, not that dramatically different. Things gradually change as the overall stream and river size gets larger and larger. So it's a continuum, right? It's not just it's this chunk and then that chunk. It's a gradient of changes, okay? Now, related to this is what we call stream gradient, okay? So when we talk about high gradient streams, I'm just going to say streams, but we talk about streams and rivers, okay? So I might just jump back and forth. I almost said flow back and forth, no pun intended. But just recognize I'm thinking about both at the same time, okay? But we might have mountain streams that are high gradient, okay? So what that means is there is a pretty large change in elevation relative to horizontal distance as you're working your way towards the bigger rivers in the ocean, okay? Low gradient stream, for a given distance, there's a much lower change in elevation, okay? It's most obvious if you look at like a mountain stream. So if you go into the Ozarks, most of that's relatively high gradient, right? Because you're up on the Ozarks and it's got to come down off the mountains, get down onto the coastal plain, and work its way out to the Gulf of Mexico. So the Ozarks are relatively high gradient. By the time you're getting into the Mississippi River, you're extremely low gradient, okay? All right, so just as an example, so this is St. Francis River near Fredericktown, classic high gradient, right? So lots of rocks, fast moving water, that type of thing.
It's a big.
So this would be a sort of a typical high gradient stream. Go across to the other side of the state, there's the Marmaton River. So very low gradient type of stream, okay? Similar stream orders for comparison here, but this one is a low gradient stream. So there's not near as much elevation change for every, let's say, kilometer or so, compared to something like this, where you've got a much steeper gradient change for that same kilometer.
So would that affect the deepness of the water for either of them, or?
I'm glad you asked.
Oh, okay. Never mind.
So, again, discussion amongst yourselves and then as a group. But, yes, stream gradient affects these things, as does stream order, right? And the two are not directly related, but often there are going to be some correlations between low order streams and gradient versus high order streams and gradient and so on, okay? So what I want you to do is to think about the following environmental factors for gradient and order. I'm thinking just generalized here, right? So I'm not asking you to what would it be for stream order 1, for 2, for 3, for 4, for 5, but just think about it as low order, high up in the headwaters versus high order where you're farther down. So how would water velocity change? Gave you a hint in the last 2 pictures. How would substrate change? Also a hint in the last 2 pictures. Water temperature, no hint, but you might be able to figure out exposure to sunlight, water depth, that type of thing. Go.
Okay. What do you think about water velocity as the gradient changes?
Well, substrate is,
Just got a big downhill, it's
Low.
gonna go faster, but the substrate.
so water.
Oh, remember,
velocity is high.
2-year-old me is gonna, everything you say, I'm gonna ask why.
Okay, so that one's high,
Immediately think habitat fragmentation.
and substrate is low.
The only thing that's gonna stay is your bigger sediments, so like your big
Although they
rocks.
do flow.
Water temperature, I would expect to be colder because the sun isn't like.
Well, hang on, when we say substrate though, are we talking about,
What the bottom of the stream is like.
I guess it depends.
okay, I didn't know if it meant
Yeah, like
cleanliness of the water, you know, how much,
I guess
The two will
if
be
it's
related to, for some
lower
extent.
water, maybe like.
alright, what about
Are
water?
you working out here though, or you talking about water?
Are you smaller?
I think it-
like the trees are.
Again, kind of depends on like the substrate. You know, when you have a relatively
Clear.
smaller stream,
Because it
Um,
doesn't put all the big rocks around it.
I
and stuff.
also feel
It
like
doesn't flow like it used to, so it's like digging into.
depending on how
And
like
so
fast the stream moves, I also feel like temperature sort of plays a role
gradient, I would expect.
there too. Because if you have fast flowing water, obviously it's going to be cooler because the water is continuously moving. Whereas if you have a slow, still stream, it's going to be really warm because the sun is directly beaming down to it, down on the surface of the water, but it's not really moving too fast. I don't know.
Pat, I got a question for you.
Mhm.
What are you doing now that I saw your email about the conservation agent? What's your plan now?
I was gonna find somewhere,
Conservation wise?
yeah, sit there for a while and then,
Like if you have a.
I didn't think I was gonna get it on the first shot. I'm not even graduated yet, so, you know.
I'm looking at Army Corps of Engineers.
Do you know if, God, what's that kid's name?
Tyler?
Tyler,
Corps of
yeah, do you know if Tyler
Engineers
got
is
anything
hiring
or
right
not?
now?
No, I'm just looking into it.
Oh, I see.
I can't ever remember his name. I feel bad about it, but I just,
All right, we got it all solved? All right, so let's do velocity. How does velocity differ between these two? Again, we're just using sort of relatively broad categories here. How does velocity change? High gradients have high velocity, right? It's just like if you were to pour water down a slope like this, it's going to go down pretty quickly. Put it on like this, it's going to hardly move at all, right? So this is going to be high velocity, and this will be low velocity. Okay? What about substrate? Basically, what's the stream bottom going to be like?
high is not gonna have a lot of sedimentation, while
Okay.
lower will have a lot of sediment.
Okay, so this will be more sediment. Teresa, would you sort of say?
When it comes to the high gradient, because the velocity is higher, it's moving all those smaller particles more downriver, so you're gonna have rockier areas.
Okay? These two are directly related to each other. When you have high velocity, smaller particles of sediments, right, like sand and silt and so on, that gets washed downstream. So you get left with larger rocks, boulders, gravel, so on, right? So cobble, we got to throw cobble in there. There's actually a whole size gradient scheme. But we got that as a general thing, it's going to be rockier. Now, let me be clear on this, right? If you go into the Ozark Stream, you still have pools where places where it does flatten out and water velocity does slow down. Those do tend to have more sediment in the bottom of the pools. So we're just talking on average, substrated high gradient is going to be more rocky, gravelly, and so on, less sediment, because it's accumulating downstream in the higher rivers, right? Hence, big muddy, right? And not only, well, we'll save that for the moment, okay? Temperature. And let's make sure we're like in the same area for this. So we're not jumping down to a high gradient seam at the equator versus large or low gradient at the North Pole. Not that that would exist, but you get my point, I hope.
I have a quick question.
Okay.
So if you have a high gradient or a low gradient that is also in a flood zone, does that change the factors that you have for this one? Or-
No, not really. No, because basically you can have flood zones along the entire river system, right? But at high gradient, when you're way up there, your river, actually that's not what I want to show, is much smaller, right? So if we have flood, the water can still come out, but it also gets in a lot quicker, right? Whereas if you're down here, when you have that flood, it stays out, right? But then all the sediments that are up here, you're not really have that much sediment, so you're not really returning sediments to the surrounding area. Where here, when you have flood under natural conditions, that's how you get those sediments out in that area and so on. All right, temperature.
Would the temperature be cooler in the high gradient because it's constantly moving faster, so the sunlight doesn't have like time to heat it up versus your slower moving?
It wouldn't be because of the movement of the water, but certainly, so let's do this. Let's come back to temperature for a second because we'll tie that in. So let's do sunlight first. What's sunlight going to be like here at a high gradient versus a low gradient?
You would have lower exposure to sunlight in a high gradient versus a higher exposure in a low gradient due to, well, one with the, going back to the velocity. Usually if you have high velocity, it's going to be washing away anything.
It wouldn't be tied to the water velocity
No.
directly.
Gosh, where have I gone? But yeah.
How does this look different?
Is it the
You have
The what?
The turbidity?
Not the turbidity.
the plant species.
The canopy, right? Because you have trees that are nearby. The stream at stream order 1, they're real close. The banks are real close to each other. So a lot of that area can be entirely covered or almost entirely covered by the tree canopy. Okay? That's one of the reasons for leaving a riparian corridor. The other one is to stop erosion. But when you have all that tree coverage over, you really have limited times a day where you're getting direct sunlight. In some cases, you're hardly ever getting direct sunlight, right? So that means your water temperature, just for that reason alone, is probably going to be cooler because you're not getting as much sunlight. It's filtered through the canopy, through the leaves and so on. Down here, broad, wide open, right? You're like, there's trees right there, but they're not having any influence on what the water temperature is. This is taking in a lot more temperature.
Wouldn't you also have kind of lower temperature on that one though because of how sedimenty the water is? You can't get the sunlight exposure deeper down. Like you could in clear
Right,
water.
I get what you're going, but the thing is because this is moving water, it tends to stay relatively uniform anyway. If it's deep and relatively calm or not moving water, you can get a gradient in there, but most of this, because there's enough flow and turbulence from that flow, that it tends to keep the water temperature relatively uniformly distributed, okay? So, that was part of it, but now, the other part, we can tie temperature back to gradient, right? So, higher gradient tends to be more up in the mountains, which average cooler air temperature, right? But once we're down here, we're down out of the mountains, we're down to average warmer temperature, right? So even if we're not going from north to south, let's say that we've got coming out of the mountains, and just right at the same latitude, right? That way we can sort of get our north-south temperature taken out of. Higher elevation tends to have cooler temperature, right? Go up in the mountains during August, really pleasant. Get down out of the mountains in August, it's much warmer, right? So that's going to, the air temperature is also going to directly influence water temperature, okay? But now here's the next part of this. Which one will have the fastest temperature change?
High gradient, low order.
High gradient, low order, right? Because the water is really shallow, and so the water temperature can change pretty quickly. Big body of water like that takes a long time to change the temperature, right? Water has a high heat capacity, so whatever temperature it is, it holds that pretty easily. But when it's really shallow, you put all that sunlight in, you can change the temperature more quickly. So as you go from day to night, you can even see greater temperature fluctuations up here than you would here, right? And so you'll see greater fluctuations within a season compared to here too.
So is that why you see freezing more in
Mhm.
low gradient?
Yeah,
than
you can
do
get
in
freezing
high
up there
gradient?
because it's so shallow and you can cool that water down.
Okay.
Where down here, it's gonna take a whole heck of a lot to do it. So we're just gonna say cooler, warmer. Okay, because again, it sort of all ties together there. And then depth, we got that one pretty straightforward. This is gonna be our deeper one. Okay, have you seen the relationship between all of these for your high order versus low order and high gradient versus low gradient? So it all ties together. Again, that's what the focus of this is, because as you change this, as you change these environmental conditions, that's going to naturally change the assemblage of fishes that are present, right? Or and the community as a whole when you start thinking about the food items and so on too, right? So it's essentially changing the entire environment of the river, which naturally changes what species are going to be present at any particular point along that continuum. Okay? So we did that, we did that, we did that, we did that. We just did that. So, what types of fishes, let's just go from small to big. What types of fishes do you think might be present up here at stream order 1 or 2 versus the bigger?
Tend to find smaller fish within the stream order 1 or 2.
You'll tend to find smaller fishes, right? You will find fishes, this is where you'll find a lot of those darters, right? So a lot of those darters live in those high gradient streams, a lot of minnows. There is Somatolus atraculatus, which is the creek chub, which actually gets up to about 12 inches or so. It's actually a decent size. You can catch it on glide hook and tackle. They're way up in the really low stream orders. You lose them when you get to bigger water. So you can see this tiny little river that's this wide, and here's this little pool, and you'll have this big old creek chub in there. It's actually kind of cool to see. Those and the daces can be up there, right? Once you get down here, what are you going to start to see more of? Won't necessarily say they're absent up here, but what would you start to see? Or it would be like a group of fishes that you might see here, that you maybe see younger ones of, or certainly far fewer of them, but you might see more or bigger down here.
Bass. Bass.
Bass, right? So if you're going to go bass fishing, in most cases you're going to go look for some bigger, deeper bodies of water, not so much in really small bodies of water, right? You get in here, that's where you might start finding smallmouth bass and that type of thing, right? Or some of the smaller largemouth bass, but for your bigger ones, you're going to go to larger bodies of water. Bigger fishes need more prey or need more food and so on, right? So, and then, again, this comes to the paper. Because you have that gradual change as you go from order 1 down to order much bigger, then you're going to see that gradual change. So there will be, like say a little bluegill or something like that, or along your sunfish up here, there will be small little basses, right? Because the youngsters can come up here and they're protected, right? Because you don't have a lot of large predators there. But as you go down, you see the shift from fewer of those species that are specialized for this high gradient, low order type of conditions for bigger water, right? So you see the gradual change, go from young individuals to larger adults and so on. So it's not just this discrete change. You can't go from order 1 to order 2 and see a very obvious difference. But as you go downriver, you will see that change, okay? But it's a gradual change. So let's focus on that because that then gets to this. So we got physical environmental conditions, that are physical environment, right? So water temperature, water velocity, those types of things. And then we can have biological factors. So that's your competition, your predator prey. For low order versus high order, which of these is most important? At low order, order 2, physical or biological factors are going to be more important for determining which species are present. And why? Always with the why. I was going to say I have all day, but really I've got 15 minutes. Which one had the more variable environment?
High gradient, low order.
I'm sorry, which?
High gradient, low order.
High gradient, low order was a more variable environment. You can see greater temperature change. If you have a heavy rain, water can come up, but it can go right back down pretty quickly. So your high gradient, low order streams tend to have greater environmental variation, right? So that's what tends to drive what's happening. The species are present. Good morning. The species that are present in low order, high gradient streams, they're affected most often by environmental factors. But as you go down farther and farther down river and you get to the larger orders, now you have a more uniform environment, okay? The other thing that happens, let me ask this, because I don't have that. Well, that's actually what this is. Complexity. Let's just think in terms of richness. How does richness change as you go from low order to high order, as you go down river? How does species richness change? Or would it be more or less equal? You're going to get more species out of order 11 on the Mississippi River or order 2 up here at Whitewater?
Mississippi.
You're going to have a lot more species in the big high order streams, right? So that's what complexity increases, the species richness. So now you have more species that are present, which means there's more possible types of interactions, right? And so in high order systems, you have a relatively uniform environment, but you have much higher species richness, which means there's a lot more potential types of competition, a lot more potential types of predator-prey interactions, right? A lot more species that are filtering the water for planktonic organisms and that type of thing. And so in high order, biological factors come into play, okay? And again, it's a gradual change because it's a continuum. So in the middle, there'll be places where you'll have where environmental changes can be important, but you're also getting more complexity for potential species interactions. But way up, certainly environmental factors are going to be the dominating processes that determine species composition. Much farther down, it's going to be the biological processes. Okay? We clear on that? Any questions? And that's the last slide, which is good because I'm all out of words.